Imagine, you're 22, working at a daycare, and suddenly your life takes like a horrifying turn. You're accused of murdering a child, like one of the kids in your care. Despite maintaining your innocence, you're convicted and sentenced to decades behind bars. This is the chilling reality for Melissa Kuzinski, and today we're going to unpack the twists and turns of her case. A case that raises profound questions about our justice system and the possibility of a devastating mistake.
Yeah. You know what's particularly intriguing about this case is that it doesn't fit the typical wrongful conviction narrative. There's no DNA evidence to re-examine, no alibi witnesses to track down. Instead, it hinges on a disputed confession, questionable medical finding, and evidence that suggests something might have gone very wrong during the investigation.
Right, and that's what makes this deep dive so compelling. We're not just looking
Yeah.
at whether Melissa's guilty or innocent. We're examining the very process that led to her conviction, and that's where things get really unsettling.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion, revealing more and more complexities with each layer.
Right. So let's go back to the beginning. It's January 14th, 2009, at Minnie Sudi Daycare in Lincolnshire, Illinois. Melissa Kuzinski, a young daycare worker, is going about her day when 16-month-old Benjamin Kingen, one of the children in her care, starts showing signs of distress. He's unresponsive, and there's foam coming from his nose. It's a terrifying situation.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that initially there's nothing to suggest foul play. There are no visible injuries on Ben, no signs of a struggle. It seems like a sudden, unexplained medical emergency.
Right. So Melissa immediately calls for help. Her sister, who also works at the daycare, rushes in and starts CPR. Well, someone calls 911. Paramedics arrive. But tragically, little Ben is pronounced dead at the hospital an hour later.
So this is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The autopsy is performed by Dr. Yipol Choi, and his findings set in motion a chain of events that will forever alter Melissa's life.
Wow. So Dr. Choi reports finding a skull fracture and determines the death a homicide. Now, suddenly, what seemed like a tragic medical emergency becomes a potential crime scene.
Right. So this determination of homicide, based on the alleged skull fracture, shifts the entire focus of the investigation. The police now have a suspect to find, and their attention quickly turns to Melissa. After all, she was the last one alone with Ben.
Exactly. So the police bring Melissa in for questioning, and this is where we start to see the cracks in the system. We're talking about a grueling 9-hour interrogation, a young woman, alone, facing seasoned detectives who are convinced she's guilty.
Right, and what's crucial to understand here is that Melissa initially denies any involvement in Ben's death over and over again. She insists she did nothing wrong, but the interrogation is relentless. The detectives dismiss her denials, suggest scenarios, and even imply that she could face the death penalty if she doesn't cooperate.
Wow, it's a classic example of coercive interrogation tactics, the kind of techniques that have been shown to lead to false confessions. And tragically, that's exactly what happens in this case.
Yeah, after hours of intense pressure, Melissa breaks down and tells the police what they want to hear. She confesses to throwing Ben to the floor in a moment of frustration, causing the fatal head injury.
But here's the catch. She immediately recants that confession, claiming it was coerced and completely false. This recantation happens almost as soon as the interrogation ends, which raises serious red flags.
Right. This is a pivotal moment. If Melissa's confession was indeed coerced, it throws the entire case into question. It means the prosecution's key piece of evidence is unreliable, potentially even tainted.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the trial, which takes place almost 3 years after Ben's death. The prosecution's case hinges on two main pillars: Melissa's confession and that alleged skull fracture. They paint a picture of a frustrated daycare worker
Who snapped.
and took her anger out on a helpless child.
And the prosecution repeatedly emphasizes the skull fracture, mentioning it over 30 times during the trial. It's clearly a cornerstone of their argument. They also present witnesses who testify about seeing Melissa being rough with children at the daycare, building a narrative of her as a short-tempered and potentially dangerous caregiver.
Wow. The defense, on the other hand, presents a very different picture. They argue that Ben's death was a tragic accident, possibly related to a prior head injury he had suffered a few months earlier.
Right. Remember, several daycare workers had testified about this prior injury, suggesting it might have been more serious than initially thought. The defense brings in medical experts who testify that this previous injury, combined with Ben's habit of headbanging, could have contributed to his death.
Right. But the trial takes a dramatic turn when the prosecution calls Dr. Manny Montez, a pathologist, to the stand. Dr. Montez delivers what seems like the knockout blow. He testifies that he physically felt a skull fracture on Ben's body during his examination.
And this testimony is incredibly powerful. It seems to corroborate the prosecution's theory and directly contradicts the defense's argument that the skull fracture never existed. It's the kind of testimony that can sway a jury, especially when presented by a seemingly credible expert witness.
Yeah, and it does sway the jury. After 7 hours of deliberation, they return with a verdict. Guilty. Melissa Kuzinski is convicted of aggravated battery of a child and first-degree murder.
Wow, the verdict sends shockwaves through the courtroom. Melissa's family is devastated. They maintain her innocence and vow to fight for her freedom. They believe that their daughter, a loving and caring young woman, has been wrongly convicted, and they're determined to uncover the truth.
But their fight for justice is just beginning. And as we'll see in part 2 of this deep dive, their journey is filled with unexpected twists, shocking revelations, and a relentless pursuit of the truth that challenges the very foundations of our legal system. Welcome back. We left off with Melissa Kuzinski's conviction, a verdict largely based on her confession and the alleged skull fracture. But hold on tight, because in this next chapter, things take a dramatic turn as new evidence emerges that challenges the very foundation of the prosecution's case.
It's often said that the truth has a way of revealing itself, and that's exactly what happens here, sometimes. All it takes is a fresh perspective, a new set of eyes looking at the evidence, to uncover crucial details that were previously overlooked.
Right, and that's where Dr. Thomas Rudd comes in. He's elected Lake County coroner in 2012, and at the urging of Melissa's attorney, he agrees to review the autopsy evidence.
Dr. Rudd's involvement is a turning point in this story. He brings a new level of scrutiny to the case, and his findings start to unravel the narrative that led to Melissa's conviction.
So Dr. Rudd meticulously goes through the autopsy reports, photographs, and evidence, and he discovers something that the original pathologist Dr. Choi had missed: evidence of an old head injury. Specifically, he finds a healing membrane in Ben's brain, indicating a previous trauma.
This discovery is huge. It introduces the possibility that Ben's death might have been related to this prior injury, not a skull fracture inflicted by Melissa on the day of his death.
And remember those daycare workers who testified about Ben bumping his head a few months earlier? Well, their accounts now become even more crucial, because they suggest that this earlier injury could have been quite serious.
Exactly. The timeline starts to shift, and the prosecution's narrative of a frustrated daycare worker causing a fatal skull fracture begins to crumble.
To further explore this new possibility, Dr. Rudd brings in another highly respected pathologist, Dr. Nancy Jones, for a second opinion.
Dr. Jones confirms the presence of the old injury and estimates it had been healing for about 2 to 3 months. And guess what? That time frame aligns perfectly with the bump on Ben's head that was observed at the daycare.
Wow. Okay, so now we have this previously overlooked head injury. That could potentially explain Ben's death. But there's another bombshell revelation waiting in the wings. Remember those supposedly unreadable x-rays the defense had at trial? The ones that were too dark to confirm or deny a skull fracture?
This is where the case takes a truly astonishing turn. In 2015, Melissa's father receives an anonymous tip about another set of x-rays existing at the coroner's office. X-rays that were never given to the defense.
It's like something out of a legal thriller, right?
Right.
Secret evidence suddenly emerging from the shadows.
It really is, and it raises serious questions about the integrity of the investigation. Were these x-rays deliberately withheld from the defense? Was there an attempt to cover something up?
Well, when Dr. Rudd's staff finally locate these x-rays in the computer archives, they are crystal clear. And guess what? They show no sign of a skull fracture.
This discovery completely flips the case on its head. The key piece of evidence used to convict Melissa, that alleged skull fracture, is now in serious doubt.
So not only do we have a potentially overlooked old injury, but now the very evidence that supposedly proved Melissa's guilt is being called into question. It's a game changer.
Absolutely. And it leads to a crucial question. If those clear x-rays had been available at trial, would the jury have reached the same verdict? It's impossible to know for sure, but it certainly casts a long shadow of doubt over the entire case.
With this new evidence in hand, Melissa is granted an evidentiary hearing in 2016. This is her chance to present this information to the judge and argue for a new trial. Her new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, a powerhouse known for her work in exonerating the wrongfully convicted, takes on the challenge.
Kathleen Zellner is a formidable force. She's known for her meticulous attention to detail, her relentless pursuit of the truth, and her unwavering belief in her client's innocence.
Zellner argues that the existence of those clear x-rays, which show no skull fracture, is game-changing evidence. That would have likely led to a different outcome at trial. But she goes a step further. She also presents evidence suggesting that the dark, unreadable X-rays given to the defense were deliberately manipulated.
This is a serious allegation. If true, it points to a deliberate attempt to withhold crucial information from the defense, potentially swaying the jury toward a guilty verdict.
And to further strengthen her case, Zellner calls Paul Foreman to the stand. He was the deputy coroner present during Ben Kingan's autopsy, and his testimony directly challenges the dramatic account given by the prosecution's star witness, Dr. Manny Montes, the one who claimed he could physically feel a skull fracture.
This is where the credibility of the prosecution's case starts to unravel even further. Foreman testifies that Dr. Montes never actually physically examined Ben's body or touched the child's skull.
Wow. So now, not only do we have potentially manipulated X-rays, but the testimony of a key prosecution witness is being directly contradicted. The foundation of the prosecution's case is crumbling.
It's a remarkable turn of events. But despite all of this, despite the new evidence and the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, the judge ultimately rules against Melissa.
It's a devastating blow for Melissa and her family. They had pinned their hopes on this evidentiary hearing, believing that the truth would finally prevail. But the legal system can be incredibly frustrating, even when new evidence seems to clearly challenge a conviction.
Yeah, the judge didn't find Foreman's testimony credible and believed the defense could have made the dark X-rays readable with the right software. It was a setback. But Zellner wasn't giving up. She appealed the ruling. But again, they hit a roadblock.
It seems like every time they take a step forward, they're pushed back. But then, in 2022, a new Lake County State's Attorney, Eric Reinhardt, takes office, and he expresses interest in the case.
Reinhardt's interest gives Melissa and her family renewed hope. He seems to recognize the potential flaws in the original investigation and wants to ensure that justice is served.
Remember those manipulated X-rays? Well, Reinhardt recommends that Zellner hire a digital forensics firm to take a closer look.
This is where the investigation takes an even more unexpected turn. The digital forensics firm concludes that the X-rays given to the defense were indeed deliberately manipulated.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Melissa Kuzinski case. We've uncovered a cascade of shocking revelations, from a potentially overlooked head injury to the possibility of manipulated evidence. And as we delve into this final chapter, we're forced to confront, uncomfortable truths about the fragility of our justice system and the devastating consequences of getting it wrong.
What's striking about this case is how each new piece of information seems to chip away at the certainty of Melissa's conviction. We're not just talking about reasonable doubt. We're talking about potentially deliberate acts that may have led to an innocent person being imprisoned.
Right, and that's where the digital forensics findings become so crucial. Their conclusion that the X-rays provided to the defense were deliberately manipulated, likely by someone within the state's attorney's office or the coroner's office, throws a dark cloud over the entire investigation.
Right. This manipulation of evidence raises a chilling question. If someone was willing to tamper with the X-rays, what else might they have been willing to do to secure a conviction? It's a thought that undermines the very foundation of trust in our legal process.
Absolutely. And as we grapple with the implications of this potential misconduct, we also need to revisit Melissa's confession, that pivotal piece of evidence that ultimately sealed her fate. Remember, she confessed after a grueling 9-hour interrogation, a confession she immediately recanted, claiming it was coerced.
Right. This is where Dr. Saul Kassan comes in, a leading expert on false confessions. He analyzed Melissa's interrogation and concluded that the tactics used by the detectives were highly coercive and problematic, especially considering Melissa's history of trauma.
So Dr. Kassan pointed out several red flags in the interrogation. The length, the detectives repeatedly dismissing Melissa's denials, the suggestions of leniency if she confessed, and the way they created a narrative that fit their theory of the crime. All these factors, he argues, created a pressure cooker environment, where a vulnerable individual might confess to something they didn't do, just to escape the situation.
Right. And his analysis is particularly relevant when we consider Melissa's recent diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline intellectual functioning. These diagnoses shed new light on her vulnerability during the interrogation and raise serious questions about the reliability of her confession.
It's crucial to understand that individuals with certain psychological conditions or intellectual disabilities can be more susceptible to coercion and suggestion during interrogations. They might be more likely to agree with the interrogator's version of events, even if it's false, simply to avoid further stress or conflict.
Exactly. And in Melissa's case, her history of trauma, coupled with her intellectual functioning, makes her particularly vulnerable to these kinds of manipulative tactics. It's a disturbing thought. And it makes you wonder how many other confessions might have been obtained under similar circumstances.
So we have a potentially manipulated investigation, a confession that's now under intense scrutiny, and a defendant with newly diagnosed conditions. That raised serious concerns about her vulnerability during interrogation. It's a lot to unpack, and it paints a very different picture than the seemingly straightforward case presented at trial.
Absolutely. And as if things weren't complicated enough, there's another layer to this story that we need to explore. Remember that earlier head injury Ben sustained at the daycare a few months before his death, the one several daycare workers testified about? Well, that becomes a significant point of focus as the investigation continues.
Right, because now the defense is exploring the possibility that someone else might have been responsible for Ben's earlier injury, an injury that could have contributed to his death. It's like another piece of the puzzle has fallen into place, shifting our understanding of what might have happened.
They start looking into Brenda, a daycare worker who is reportedly with Ben when the earlier injury occurred. It's a new lead, a new avenue to explore in the search for the truth.
So the podcast producers actually managed to locate and interview Brenda, but she denies any involvement in Ben's prior injury.
This is another twist in an already convoluted case. If Brenda wasn't responsible for Ben's earlier injury, who was? And could that person have played a role in Ben's death? It opens up a whole new set of questions and possibilities.
So with all this new evidence and conflicting information, a clemency petition is filed with Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker in April 2024. The petition requests that Melissa be either exonerated or granted a reduced sentence. Based on the mounting evidence suggesting her conviction was a miscarriage of justice, it's a beacon of hope, a chance for Melissa's case to be reviewed in light of all the new discoveries.
This clemency petition becomes Melissa's best hope for freedom. It's a chance for the governor to step in, consider the new evidence, and potentially right a wrong. The stakes are incredibly high, and everyone involved is holding their breath.
But there's a major roadblock. Lake County State's Attorney Eric Reinhardt, the one who initially expressed interest in the case and recommended the digital forensics investigation, unexpectedly opposes the clemency petition. It's a shocking development that no one saw coming.
This is a truly perplexing turn of events. Everyone, including Melissa's attorneys, believed Reinhardt was on her side. They thought he recognized the flaws in the original investigation and was committed to finding justice. But his opposition to the clemency petition throws a wrench into everything.
Right. In a letter to the Prisoner Review Board, Reinhardt states there's no new evidence in the case, and that Melissa's petition doesn't establish innocence. This unexpected opposition creates a significant obstacle for Melissa's fight for freedom. It's like a door has been slammed shut just as it seemed to be opening.
It's a frustrating reminder that even when there seems to be clear evidence of a wrongful conviction, political considerations and prosecutorial biases can still stand in the way of justice. It's a sobering reality, and it highlights the complexities of our legal system.
Despite this setback, a hearing is held before the Prisoner Review Board on July 9, 2024. The board is tasked with reviewing the case and making a confidential recommendation to the governor. It's a tense and emotional day, with the weight of Melissa's future hanging in the balance.
This hearing is a stark contrast of perspectives. Melissa's attorneys present a compelling case for her release, outlining the new evidence and highlighting the flaws in the original investigation. They argue that the manipulated x-rays, the coerced confession, and the overlooked head injury all point to a miscarriage of justice.
On the other side, Ben Kingan's parents deliver a heartbreaking statement, urging the board to deny Melissa's petition. They express their profound grief over the loss of their son and argue that Melissa should remain in prison for her crime. It's a raw and emotional plea that underscores the tragedy of this situation.
It's important to acknowledge the pain and anguish of Ben's parents. Their loss is immeasurable, and their desire for justice is completely understandable. However, this case forces us to grapple with the possibility that the pursuit of justice might have led to the wrong person being punished. It's a complex and heart-wrenching dilemma.
It truly is. A young child is dead. A young woman is in prison for a crime she may not have committed. And there are no easy answers. It's a stark reminder that our justice system, while striving for fairness, is not infallible.
Exactly. This case is a microcosm of the larger issues within our legal system. It highlights the potential for error, the impact of bias, and the challenges of seeking justice in a system that is ultimately run by human beings.
A Prisoner Review Board made its confidential recommendation to the governor in January 2025. But as of today, Governor Pritzker has yet to make a decision. Melissa, her family, and everyone who believes in her innocence are left waiting, hoping that the truth will prevail, and she will finally be free. It's a waiting game filled with anxiety, hope, and the weight of uncertainty.
This case leaves us with more questions than answers. Was this a tragic accident? Or was there foul play involved? Was Melissa coerced into a false confession? Was evidence deliberately manipulated to secure a conviction? And ultimately, will justice be served? These are questions that linger, long after we finished exploring the details of this case.
Melissa's story serves as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that our justice system, while designed to protect the innocent, is not perfect. It's a system run by human beings, and human beings are capable of making mistakes, misjudgments, and even deliberate acts of misconduct. We need to be aware of these vulnerabilities, to hold our systems accountable, and to never stop questioning the pursuit of justice.
And it leaves us with a final, thought-provoking question. If Melissa didn't cause Ben's death, what happened that day? Could there be another explanation? A piece of the puzzle that's still missing? This is a question that will likely continue to haunt those involved in this case, and those who have followed Melissa's story.
We encourage you to continue thinking about this case, about the power of confession, the possibility of wrongful conviction, and the complexities of seeking justice in a system that is always evolving. What are your thoughts on the case? Could there be another explanation for Ben's death? That no one has considered yet. The mystery continues. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.